In February of 1991, in the deserts north of Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, the United States Army was sitting on top of 40,000 shipping containers and did not know what was inside more than half of them. The paperwork existed. The manifests had been written somewhere by someone, but the link between a container's serial number and its contents had broken down weeks earlier, back in the loading yards of Fort Bragg and Fort Hood and Fort Stewart. And once that link broke, it never reconnected. Soldiers in the field who needed a specific spare part, a fuel pump, a radiator hose, a tank track pin, could not order it from a warehouse 3 miles away because no one could say which of the 40,000 boxes held it. The only reliable way to find anything was to physically open containers one at a time and look. Logisticians in theater gave this problem a nickname that stuck. They called it the Iron Mountain. 2.5 years later, in the autumn of 1993, a Defense Logistics Agency colonel named Kenneth Pravratsky sat in a briefing room in Memphis, Tennessee, inside a building that belonged to a company most soldiers only knew as the source of the little vans with the purple and orange arrow tucked between the E and the X. He was watching package volume scroll across a screen in real time. Every parcel that moved through the building had a barcode. Every barcode had been scanned at pickup, scanned again at the sort facility, scanned a third time on the delivery truck, and scanned a fourth time on the customer's doorstep. And at every one of those 4 scans, the system updated a central database that anyone with the right terminal could query in seconds. A package that left Memphis at midnight could be located by city, by truck, by approximate minute, by a customer service representative on a headset in a call center who had never seen the package and never would. The Pentagon had spent 2 years and several $billion trying to build a system that did the same thing for tank parts and could not make it work reliably at brigade level. A package delivery company in Tennessee had been doing it every night since 1973. This is the story of why the most logistically sophisticated military in human history looked at an overnight parcel company and decided it had something to learn, and of why the answer to "what does the package look like" turned out to be the same answer to "where did the war effort go wrong?" It is the story of how a small adhesive label with a series of black and white bars on it became, in the eyes of the United States Department of Defense, more strategically important than radar-absorbent paint. You are watching WW2 Tales, except this time, the war is the one nobody calls a war, the one fought entirely in warehouses, manifests, and the 4-inch gap between a requisition form and the part it was supposed to summon. To understand why a corrugated cardboard system designed to move Christmas presents became a matter of national security, you have to go back to the deserts of 1990 and ask a question that sounds almost embarrassingly simple. If a soldier in Saudi Arabia needs a part, and that part exists somewhere in the supply chain, how long does it take? And how does anyone find out where it is? In the months after Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, the United States moved roughly 500,000 troops and their equipment to the Persian Gulf in the largest military deployment since the Second World War. The deployment itself, as a feat of raw lift capacity, worked. Ships sailed, aircraft flew, tanks arrived. The part of the system that broke was not the movement of large things across oceans. It was the tracking of small things once they were in theater. The Government Accountability Office later documented the breakdown in a series of reports with titles that read like Understatement by Design, Operation Desert Storm, Lack of Accountability over Material During Redeployment. The investigators found that the Army had lost track of materiel during the deployment to the Middle East and had not established basic accountability over the materiel during the redeployment process, only beginning to account for it after it had already been shipped back to the United States and processed at its final destination. The detail that traveled furthest in logistics circles, the one that got repeated in briefing after briefing for the rest of the decade, was the container count. Of more than 40,000 large shipping containers sent into theater, the contents of more than half could not be readily identified once they arrived. Soldiers needing a part could not search a database and find which container held it. The only method that reliably worked was the one available to a man with a crowbar in 1944. Open the box and look inside. Units desperate for parts that they believed, correctly, were somewhere in the pipeline resorted to a practice that became known informally as the Christmas tree effect, sending duplicate and triplicate requisitions for the same item through every channel available, on the theory that if you asked 5 times, one of the 5 requests might eventually surface a part. The Army's own after-action reporting estimated that better asset tracking during the redeployment alone could have saved on the order of $2 billion. Money spent not because the parts did not exist, but because nobody could prove they already existed. So new ones got ordered, shipped, and duplicated on. The military did not lack engineers capable of building a tracking system. It lacked a tracking culture. The Defense Department's supply chain had been engineered for decades around the logic of the warehouse and the depot. Large central holding points, paper requisition forms routed through multiple layers of approval, item movement recorded in batches at fixed checkpoints rather than continuously. A tank engine leaving a depot in Texas generated paperwork at the moment it left the depot, and paperwork again at the moment it arrived somewhere else. And in the gap between those 2 paper events, the engine was, for practical tracking purposes, a ghost. It existed. It was moving. Nobody's database said where. Commercial parcel carriers had solved a version of this exact problem a decade and a half earlier, and they had solved it for a much more mundane reason: profit margin. Federal Express was founded in 1971 by Frederick W. Smith, and by the early 1970s, the company had built its hub-and-spoke sorting operation in Memphis, the city chosen specifically because of its central geography and reliable weather for night flying. The hub-and-spoke model meant that nearly every package in the system funneled through one building each night, which created both an enormous operational challenge and an enormous tracking opportunity. If you could scan a package every single time it changed hands inside that funnel, you would always know exactly where it was, because there were only so many places it could possibly be. The barcode made that scanning practical at scale. The technology itself long predated FedEx. The Universal Product Code had been adopted by grocery retailers earlier in the same decade, and the underlying barcode patent dated back to 1952 work by Norman Joseph Woodland and Bernard Silver. What FedEx did was apply that retail checkout technology to a problem retail had never had to solve: tracking a single, uniquely identified item through multiple custody transfers across a continent in under 24 hours, and making that tracking information queryable by a stranger on a telephone. By the early 1980s, the company had built a system, later marketed under the name Cosmos, that assigned a unique tracking number to every package and updated its location at every scan point: pickup, hub arrival, hub departure, delivery vehicle loading, and final delivery confirmation. A customer could call an 800 number, give an operator a string of digits, and learn in real time that their package was 41 minutes from their door. To a 1985 customer, this felt like a minor convenience. To a 1993 Defense Logistics Agency colonel standing in the Memphis Operations Center, watching the same dataset scroll past, it looked like the single most valuable piece of intellectual property in the entire civilian logistics industry. And the Pentagon did not have anything close to it. The man most associated with bringing that realization back to the Pentagon and turning it into doctrine was a logistics officer who, by the time he reached general's rank, had become known semi-officially within the Army as its leading evangelist for what the doctrine called total asset visibility. Total asset visibility, or TAV, was not a single piece of software. It was a target state, the ability at any moment to know the identity, location, movement status, and condition of any piece of military equipment or supply anywhere in the world, the same way a FedEx customer service representative could locate a parcel. The phrase appears, dated and stamped, across more than 3 decades of Government Accountability Office reports because the Department of Defense set TAV as a formal goal starting in the early 1990s and was still chasing full implementation more than 30 years later. A 2004 GAO review opened by noting that the department had been working for more than 30 years to achieve full visibility over its spare parts inventory and still had not gotten there, with the department's own internal target for completion having been pushed out to the year 2010, a target that, like several before it, came and went without the goal being fully met. The reason the goal kept sliding was not a lack of urgency, it was architecture. The Defense Department's logistics operation was not one organization with one database. It was, and remains, an interlocking set of separate service logistics commands, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, each running its own legacy information systems, many of them written decades earlier in programming languages that had few remaining trained engineers, none of them originally designed to talk to one another. A 2007 GAO report on the Army's asset visibility investments noted almost wearily that supply chain management had been on GAO's official high-risk list of troubled federal programs since 1990 and had still not come off it 17 years later. The Army had what auditors called stovepiped systems, a phrase that shows up in congressional testimony from the mid-1990s through the mid-2000s with almost no variation because the underlying problem did not change for a decade and a half. Dr. Paul Kaminsky, then an Undersecretary of Defense, gave a speech in 1995 laying out a grand vision for logistics integration. A House Armed Services Subcommittee chairman, reading that same speech back into the record nearly a decade later, observed dryly that too much of what Kaminsky had said in 1995 was still true, word for word, in 2004. The contrast with the commercial sector was not lost on the people doing the comparing, and it became almost a rhetorical tick in congressional hearings. Officials would compare the Pentagon's supply chain to Walmart, and then immediately feel obligated to walk the comparison back, because the comparison was, in a precise sense, unfair to the Pentagon. A retail supply chain moves predictable goods along predictable routes to fixed store locations that never get shelled, never get overrun, and never have to operate in a sandstorm. A 2004 congressional witness statement put the caveat directly on the record that it would be inaccurate to compare the Department of Defense logistics process to a Walmart store, because Walmart did not have to deliver inventory to a location that might not exist by the time the truck arrived, run by soldiers who might be in contact with an enemy force at the moment of delivery. The Pentagon's problem was structurally harder than FedEx's problem, but that only made the visibility gap more expensive, not less real. What the Pentagon actually borrowed from the commercial carriers was not abstract inspiration. It was specific, named technology, acquired through specific, named contracts. The Defense Logistics Agency formally studied what became known as DLA premium service arrangements with FedEx and UPS, examining what effect commercial premium delivery contracts had on the broader defense distribution system, a study eventually written up by the Defense Technical Information Center under the heading of Effects on Defense Distribution Performance. The underlying idea was almost embarrassingly direct. Instead of trying to rebuild a FedEx-grade tracking and delivery network from inside the Pentagon's own bureaucracy, Simply pay FedEx and UPS to move and track military spare parts using the infrastructure those companies had already built, and bolt the resulting tracking data onto the military's own systems, wherever the two could be made to connect.
Alongside the contracts came the technology transfer. The Department of Defense adopted automatic identification technology, AIT, as a formal pillar of its 1990s focused logistics concept, one of the named operational pillars of the Pentagon's Joint Vision 2010 doctrine. Stripped of the acronym, AIT meant exactly what it sounds like it means. Put a machine-readable tag on everything, scan it at every transfer point, and feed every scan into a database that anyone in the chain of command could query. Precisely the architecture FedEx had been running since the early 1980s. Doctrine documents from the period describe joint total asset visibility as providing users with timely and accurate information by fusing logistics data across units and combat support agencies worldwide. Bureaucratic language for make the Pentagon's tracking work the way the package tracking on your kitchen counter already works. The technology was not in itself exotic. A barcode is one of the least exotic pieces of information technology in existence. It had been sitting on the side of cereal boxes for nearly 2 decades before the Pentagon decided it needed one on a cargo pallet. What made adopting it hard was not the barcode. It was the requirement to redesign the entire surrounding institutional process around a simple principle that FedEx had built its whole company on: scan everything, every time with no exceptions, and trust the database over a soldier's memory or a clipboard. The Defense Logistics Agency, established under Title 10 of the U.S. Code as the Defense Department's combat support agency for supply distribution, had by the 2000s grown into an organization managing roughly 5 million distinct consumable, expendable, and repairable items across the entire armed forces. Retrofitting automatic identification technology onto a 5 million item catalog spread across thousands of installations, depots, ships, and forward operating bases was not a software update. It was closer to performing open-heart surgery on an institution while that institution continued fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time. The slowness showed up in audit after audit, each one a small iron mountain of its own. A 1999 GAO review found that the Defense Department's Total Asset Visibility Initiative, launched specifically to resolve the wartime logistics problems experienced during the Gulf War, still lacked the kind of structured implementation framework that GAO recommended for measuring whether the initiative was actually working. A 2000 GAO review of Army shipped inventory controls found that the Army could not account for roughly $900 million in shipped inventory in a single fiscal year. Not necessarily stolen, in most cases simply undocumented. Items that had in fact arrived, but had never been logged in the way regulations required. The digital age descendant of the unopened, unidentified container sitting in the Saudi desert 9 years earlier. A 2004 follow-up GAO report found the department still had not developed the kind of long-term strategic plan GAO had been recommending since 1999, and reiterated the same 2010 target date the department had already set for itself once before. A 2007 review of the Army's specific asset visibility system investments found again no coherent integrated strategy tying the various tracking programs together. Different services were still, in important respects, building their own separate solutions to the same FedEx-shaped problem, rather than adopting one shared one. By the time these reports were stacking up, on the actual battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers and logisticians were rediscovering the Iron Mountain problem in new forms, and rediscovering again that the commercial-style barcode and database approach was the only thing that reliably fixed it. An Army officer writing in the professional journal Army Logistician years later, reflecting on a redeployment role in the original 1991 Gulf War, used the Iron Mountain phrase explicitly to describe how the same failure pattern reappeared in subsequent post-Cold War interventions.
poor in-transit visibility, poor total asset visibility, and a resulting logistics system that could not answer the basic question of where a given piece of equipment currently was. The pattern did not disappear because doctrine declared it solved. It disappeared piece by piece, installation by installation, only as automatic identification technology actually got installed, scanner by scanner, depot by depot, in the unglamorous decades-long process that government auditors kept documenting and complaining was too slow. None of this made the underlying military hardware irrelevant, any more than the existence of a brilliant chassis design made the Panther's final drive failures irrelevant a half-century earlier. The war effort still depended on stealth aircraft, precision munitions, and nuclear submarines, all of which the Pentagon continued to design and build with genuine technical brilliance throughout this same period. But a Tomahawk missile is useless sitting in the wrong warehouse, and a tank battalion's combat readiness is identical to zero if its replacement transmission cannot be located among 40,000 undifferentiated boxes in a desert staging area. The Pentagon's most embarrassing vulnerability in the 1990s and 2000s was not a missing weapon system. It was a missing tracking number. The exact piece of information that a teenager... That is the reason a Pentagon colonel sat in a briefing room in Memphis in 1993 studying a parcel company's operations center the way a previous generation of officers might have studied a captured piece of enemy radar. It is the reason the words barcode, automatic identification technology, and total asset visibility appear dead serious inside Joint Vision 2010, alongside dominant maneuver and precision engagement, as one of the named pillars of how America intended to fight its next war. And it is the reason that decades later, when defense planners assess whether the United States military logistics system is ready to support a high-intensity conflict against a major power, the Defense Science Board's own language about that risk still echoes the Gulf War complaint almost word for word, warning that the joint logistics enterprise has suffered years of neglect and underfunding relative to other Defense Department priorities, and that the strategic system for moving troops, weapons, and supplies over long distances has decayed and needs urgent modernization to be ready for any future high-end fight.
The German Type 21 submarine and the American Liberty ship were both, in the end, about whether a part dropped in or had to be hand-fitted. The Iron Mountain of 1991 and the FedEx hub in Memphis were about a question one level upstream of that. Not whether the part fits, but whether anyone can find it in time to fit it at all. A nation can master the gauge, the jig, and the interchangeable part, exactly as the United States did across 150 years, from Springfield to Detroit, and still lose the next war to an iron mountain of its own boxes if it cannot answer, instantly and from anywhere, the question that a stranger on a customer service phone line in Memphis could already answer in 1985 without even glancing up from the screen. Where is it right now? The Pentagon spent 30 years and several billion dollars learning that lesson from a package delivery company, one scanned barcode at a time. If you found this story worth your time, consider liking the video and subscribing for more. We have more to tell about the Gulf War logistics failures, more about the Defense Logistics Agency's modernization fights, more about the long and unglamorous war for total asset visibility. We will see you on the next one.